the rest of the panelists who will be joining us after the presentation. I'll start with Funke Opeke, and she's the founder of Main One, which was the first private company in West Africa to land a submarine cable, and it was acquired for $320 million at late 2021. And the next person next to her is Nitin Gajria, who's the Director General of Sub-Saharan Africa at Google. And next to him is Lassina Kone, who's the Director General and CEO at Smart Africa, which is an organization that has the vision of transforming Africa into a single digital market. And right next to him is Colin Hu, and Colin is the President of Enterprise and Cloud at Huawei, Huawei Northern Africa. And I think I might be missing one panelist. Oh, I'm really sorry. We're not met in person. Yes. And next to him is Ebenezer Asante, who's the Senior Vice President at Markets at MTN. Apologies. Wonderful. So thank you. And now I'll hand over to Adama.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to give the keynote on this exceptional panel that has been presented on such a strategic topic. I don't know whether the presentation is ready. Okay. In 6 minutes, I want to share with you some insight on this topic, and I will start by saying that we are living in the data-driven world. As a matter of fact, you know, all the companies that are controlling the world, the so-called GAFA, we have a representation, a representative of GAFA here. The G of the GAFA is here. All the unicorns that also are big ambition in Africa, they are those who produce, collect, store, control our data. And thanks to innovation, thanks to digitalization, social media, we have an increased level of data that are producing every day. You have some illustration. Each second, you have 120 megabytes of data created by each internal user. For those who knew the floppy disk, what was in 20 years ago, it's like you are creating 100 floppy disks per minute, using one floppy disk per minute, per internal user. So those companies are controlling the data. And what is the place of Africa in this data economy? The answer is almost nothing. Even the number of users is growing faster than other places in the world. For example, from 2022 to 2025, the growth of internet user in Africa will be 20% compared to 10% in the world. However, you have only 80 data centers in Africa compared to the 8,000 data centers in the world. So we can estimate that only 1% of data are stored of African data are stored in Africa. So this will require a lot of investment. Today, only 2.6 billion are invested in building capabilities for data centers in Africa. This need to be at least doubled if we want to having Africa having a fair share on this topic, and also that will require energy. Okay, we need also to invest in that. But the most important challenge here is, as I said, the firm that produce control our data are not African. Okay, so we really need to have an environment that help our government, our companies to protect especially personal data. Here you can see, for example, that Africa is the continent where you have the highest numbers of countries without any legislation on data protection. And even when you go deeper, even the countries that are saying that they have data protection legislation, those legislations are not enforceable. Okay? So this is really, really scary, and it's the government are aware of that, but the speed in which they are closing this gap is too low. What is behind data protection? We have 6 pillars of personal data protection. When you are seeing internet user on internet, on social media, filling some formulas, you have some company that are requesting data. All of these client experience need to be protected. The first one is the lawfulness, fairness, transparency, and processes, meaning that all the companies that are using African data have to comply with some law. The second is the purpose specification. Why are you asking me to store, to provide this information? So you need to notify the user what you will do with the data. Proportionality and necessity, very important also. You need to be sure that the data you are collecting from customers are used for a purpose, okay, and are used for a need. Okay, data accuracy is very important to give to African internet user or companies the ability to correct or to erase inaccurate data. Okay? The fifth pillar will be limitation of data retention. You have to erase data when they are no longer useful. Okay? And the last one, but not the least, is data integrity and confidentiality. This deal with security, cyber security, how to protect the customers from data breach. And so those 6 pillars are essential in the protection of customer and in the data, personal data protection. And as you have seen in the slide before, in Africa, we are really late. So it's a paradox. We are exporting our data in outside Africa, and we are not able to control even the data that are on our we are exporting. So I have just 6 minutes. So I will end with this this message, especially for the CEOs that are here. Everyone is digital, is moving on digitization. One important thing is to know is data is the fuel of digitization. Sorry, it's a way for public authority to modernize the economy, how to identify, administer, and protect the people. But for the companies, the best you know and understand your customer, the best you are a leader, and data is essential for that. You are seeing a lot of disruptive use of data for behavioral analysis to optimize the customer experience, to perform strategic watch market analysis, and also in the day-to-day business. It's essential to evaluate the data you collect for strategic decision, even to reduce the expensive and also the expenses, and it's a powerful tool for risk management and compliance. So data is the new gold, but from regulation to harmonization, and when you think about data availability also, the challenge for you, panelists, is to say how you can reconcile the objective of independence or sovereignty, while you need to protect also the data, and also help CEOs, leaders, to better take advantage from data. So what infrastructure we need to build? What human capital? We have a lack of data scientists in Africa. How can we handle that? What regulation, and how we can protect ourselves from cybersecurity linked to that? So you have 1 hour to respond to all of these questions. Thanks a lot.
40 minutes.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Aristide. And now I'll welcome the speakers to join me on stage. Thank you, everyone. So my first question, I think Aristide for just setting the pace for the discussion and giving us the context from where we can move forward. So my first question will actually go to Lassina. I want to hear more of your reflections on, because he talks about how there's 71% of countries, there's 71% of countries that have some sort of regulation, but the trick is in the implementation. So I'd love to hear about this disconnect in terms of data control, in terms of regulation versus implementation.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for these good organizations, and also the Mr. Ouattara, who actually presented. It's true, like 33 countries only have in Africa a law on data protection or cybersecurity, but in reality, majority of those are not really enforceable, and that's a very unfortunate. And I like the fact that when he said, Africa, we are very late, I'm afraid I have to say that the fact that we're late, it helps us do things in the right way. For one reason. All in this room here, somehow we're using one app from the GAFAM. So technically speaking, we are all colonized. I will explain myself very quickly. What is the difference back in our fathers' grandfathers' time, where the raw material are taken from Africa, processed outside Africa, sold back to us as a package of chocolate, then having access to our data today and process it somewhere in Ireland with the GAFAM and sent and targeted as a marketing. It's the same, but there is one major difference. The first exporting the raw material is finite. The second one is infinite. It basically is a digital colonization perpetual for everyone, not just Africa. So this is a very serious issue. So the fact that the lack of data regulatory in Africa, that's what Smart Africa has been engaging. A coalition of 32 countries today, remember, Pan-African, based in Rwanda, working on the policy harmonization in data protection and the data governance. And a couple of months ago, actually, we actually elaborated the guidance for the data protection, piggybacking on the Malabo Conventions that Africa Union worked on, to be encouraging, actually, our data protection agency. Not only that, we're also building the capacity. We're doing the capacity building to be able to reinforce. Because major issue in Africa, regulatory issue is one thing, helping also, I would say, assisting our agencies to be able to enforce the law. Second thing, the third thing, it is the capacity building for everyone, basically mean typical user, because we are sitting in our home and we do everything with the phone. We don't really know where your data is being stored. And it is actually very, very dangerous. But the fact that we are late, I think it's actually a big advantage to us because we are today 70% of the digital economy is controlled by the United States of America. 22% is controlled by China. Africa controls about 1.5%. Europe controls about 3.4%. Technically speaking, Europe has lost the battle. So the last frontier will be Africa. That's the reason we need to wake up. And I'm very happy to have all the players here. I have my friend here from GAFAM. We have Afro champion here, MTN, of course, operator. Also, we have Afro champion here in the data center business, also submarine cable. And we have also the supplier. I think all the decision can come actually from this room. Thank you.
That sounds good. Thank you. And I think we're gearing up for a very vibrant discussion given the different organizations that we have here. So my next question goes to Colin. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the roles and responsibilities of the different players when we are talking about data ecosystem. So the roles and responsibilities of the government, enterprises, vendors, and all these other players in this ecosystem.
Yes, thank you. My name is Colin. And totally agree, with Lucina, his comments, regarding the law, and how the law could be implemented and enforced. And I give a small, quick example. And in one of the leading countries in Africa, and there's one company from China, Didi. It's like Uber, and they want to launch the services. And by the law, and they need to find host data, host the infrastructure in the country. And after 6 months, they cannot find a proper data center and which can host these services because what they need is a cloud-native environment. So this gives the government then to implement the law, and then as a supplier, could be a data center supplier, could be a cloud provider, needs to have the service ready, and also the users, and we need to have the awareness that we need to have this sense of data sovereignty, and then beyond, it's not about one country. It's a collaborated move as a continent, as a region, because like Lucina said, even Europe, they failed the war in the cloud computing in the industry, and how can we in Africa to win the war if by country? So even this PDPR or the GDPR, it's not for one country. It should be a coordinated move across Africa. So this is the role which should be played by different organizations and by the companies and even by the consumer.
And I think, thank you, Colin, and I think you bring up an interesting element on the balkanization of the data ecosystem on the continent. And so my next question goes to Ebenezer. I would love to hear how you've seen this come to play for MTN, which has huge reach across the continent.
No, thank you very much. Where do we come in? First and foremost is to play in line with the platform strategy that we have. At the end of the day, if we're going to connect the subscribers in our markets to be able to deliver the digital solutions, we must also ensure that the data center requirements are all in place. Then the second thing, we also own some of the data center infrastructure. And how do we bring it into the global marketplace? Because the specialization required not only to monetize the data center, but also put them to good use, will not necessarily be determined by what we do at MTN, but also bringing other ecosystem players into the fray, some of the global players who would also be willing to work with us and partner with us to take it from where we are today into hyperscaler. There is also the angle of the efficiency in the data centers, and I know that is where the tension between do we go national, do we go continental, or do we just remain very small in every single market? The expert who did a presentation pointed out quite clearly that in as much as there are 8,000 data centers serving 5.2 billion population. In Africa, we have 80 serving about 600,000 users. So if you do the quick sum, you have 650,000 users per data center elsewhere. And in Africa, you have 7,500 users per data center. So clearly, there is some issue with economy. It has a dimension with the cost. It also has some dimension with the scope. So I'm not surprised that others may want to come into this market and cannot find any conducive data center, the equivalent of the play that they are used to work within. There is also the last bit I want to touch on in terms of partnership. So your concerns are also addressed, and we don't end up in a fray of self-exploited colonization. This time, it's not somebody exploiting us. We are the ones doing it to ourselves. And that's why the entities like what our sister runs, one, and the others become very, very important. How do we also ensure that even as we bring the global players on board, we also build internal continental capacity to partner?
Sounds good. And I think that's a great way to segue actually to Funke. How, when we're talking about how we are building this capacity for the benefit of the continent, I'd love to hear how do we build these local ecosystems that actually benefit the African startups?
Okay. No, thank you. And really trying to tie it all together, I would say certainly the laws play a role. And obviously there is a challenge. But the flip side of that is also the attractiveness and the value some of these global platforms and applications build. And I think the challenge for Africa is not to legislate those platforms out, but to find the win-win. So different from the colonial times, how do you get the advantages of the new technologies and the new platforms and still protect your economic interests, your intellectual property, ensure data sovereignty, and protect the interests and the economic well-being of your citizens? And I think it's a delicate balance. It's one that we haven't gotten right, I have to say, on the continent, because I don't think the laws necessarily just by themselves and enforcement will do it, because there are large economic forces at play here. But it's finding the right balance. I think some of that right balance just comes down to pragmatism and economics. If you build the infrastructure here, if Africa starts providing some of the value chain that's required to create that data, to share that data, to store that data, if that is resident within the continent, then the laws of the continent apply. And then you could start enforcing those laws. So it's chicken and egg. It's ensuring you have the environment. It's ensuring you have the infrastructure. It's ensuring, it's realizing or recognizing, just like airlines, that you're not going to have an international airport flying the largest jumbo jets in every city, but that you're going to create regional hubs, and that regional cooperation will be critical to serving the needs of the citizens. And I think we need to start looking for how we achieve that pragmatic balance. When we look at the size of our economies, when we look at the size of the data we consume, just as we've said, in reality, it's a drop in the bucket compared to more advanced markets. So how do we make even our markets interesting to attract the technology we need, but have the protection in place and have the capability that we can still maintain our data sovereignty? And I think that's the challenge that we face, and we need to be careful that we don't see just putting the laws in place and enforcing the laws that say thou shalt, because I think then we run the risk of some of our markets just being completely left behind.
Thank you. And Nitin, this is where I'll come to you because I've heard you talk about the difference between data sovereignty and data localization. So I'd love for you to elaborate on that a bit more.
Yeah, for sure. First of all, thank you for having me. Just for the record, I'm here from Google, not from GAFAM. Just so we're absolutely clear about that. Look, I don't think anyone in this room is probably going to argue with the need for regulations that ensure data sovereignty. There's no question about that. I think everyone will universally agree on that. The thing that worries me sometimes is that we use data localization and data sovereignty interchangeably. And I think that we might need to look at that. When I think about data sovereignty, what is it that we need to ensure? We need to ensure that ownership of the data is clear. We need to ensure that control and use of that data is clear. We need to ensure that cross-border data flows, control of cross-border data flows is clear. And we need to ensure that the choice of what infrastructure to use to process that data is clear. And my proposition is, especially given the stage of the internet economy that we're at this stage, and I completely agree, by the way, I think it's an advantage that we're late. I think it's a massive advantage that we're late because it helps us do things right the first time rather than try to break existing paradigms. It's harder to break existing paradigms. So the question is, can you achieve all of those things without data localization, right? If I'm a startup, and I'm a big fan of the startup ecosystem on the continent, we're seeing a tremendous amount of progress, we're seeing a huge amount of capital come through, $4.5 billion last year, but that $4.5 billion is still 1/20th of, let's say, India. Now, I know India is one country, Africa is 54 countries, but comparable GDP per capita, kind of. So there's a massive amount of upside to nurture an innovation ecosystem, to nurture a startup ecosystem on the continent, right? Now, if I start telling a fintech startup that you need to host your data, in order to scale your business, you need to host your data separately in every individual country that you operate in, those are things that get in the way of scale. So I agree 100% on the objective of data sovereignty, and I don't think anyone here would disagree with that. We need to get to the next level of detail on what that really means.
And actually, I was coming over to you. So, Lassina, I'd love you to reflect on something Ebenezer said, because he talked about how we don't have enough data centers. Every data center has too many people who would have to save their data there for it to make any sort of sense. But we also have low utilization rates of the existing ones. Then add to that what Nitin has mentioned about clouds, moving to the cloud versus data centers. So could some of these discussions be becoming obsolete? So I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you, yeah. Before I actually answer or I take the floor, let's go back to what data we're talking about when we talk about data economy. What is happening today in the market or on the whole internet world in Africa with respect to Africa is just the tip of the iceberg. Because the real data lies, the data which are used meaningfully. I'm talking about user-centric generated data. You work with the Ministry of Transportation, you get some service from there, education, health, you are sitting at a center. All this data you're collecting, that is a meaningful data that can be used for decision makers in the government. But that's today, the data we're talking about, that Google and others, I'm not gonna say GAFAM, Google and others are using actually, it is not that data. When we say data is mine, it's a new mine today, it's a new oil. We at Smart Africa, we're talking about meaningful data where the citizen at the centric. Our government, different government, we don't have that. Because everyone is sitting on the silo of data. That's very true. But it's only when we have a digital identification to be able to aggregate all this information, then it will be meaningful. The way we are doing it in Smart Africa is using Smart Africa Trust Alliance. We're not looking at what individual country. The Trust Alliance mean when we are putting a citizen as African in the middle, the services you're getting here from Benin, you will get the same services, for example, in Senegal, because you're trackable with the digital identification, which puts you at the center of services. This is, of course, as a precursor of all the CFTA coming out, Continental Free Trade Agreement. In fact, we signed an MOU with them. That is the real data I'm talking about. When coming back to what my brother Ebenezer said, enough data center, yes, look, the internet users in Africa are bigger than America, yet we have the size of the data center of Switzerland. That's true. We are the biggest user in terms of number. We are bigger than America, and we have the size of the data center of Switzerland. It does not make sense. Because why it does not make sense? The World Bank report said Africa needs to create 22 million jobs a year from now to 2030. That is the burden on every single government. So if our data is being analyzed in Ireland, in Switzerland, in Germany, and whatnot, and we have our young people where they represent 65 to 70% below 30 years old. These are the future data scientists. If Africa is going to be conquering the world, if I can say by 2050, by taking about 42% of the world workforce, then we better start now. So my question is this. Google and others, it's very interesting to have a fancy data sitting outside. But why not come to basically host the hyperscaler services and, for example, main one data centers? We do have data centers. We rallied at Smart Africa for the past 3 months, Senegal, Ghana, Djibouti, Rwanda. We found that it's not really a lack of data centers, probably lack of data centers to the higher quality of the hyperscaler. I'm talking about Tier 3, Tier 4, we get them here. But we found fundamentally some big difference. Our government and enterprises are not using cloud services. They prefer to use cloud service ERP solution based in Germany than ERP solution hosted in Ghana on the data center. That is the fact. And this is why this is happening. It's a lack of trust. How many of our ministers, you meet them, they have a Gmail email and they don't have their own minister's email. So do you trust Google more than the government? It's a fundamental question here. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would welcome, I think, Funke, you seem to have a reaction to Lasina's comments.
Yes, I do agree with the challenge. And I was going to say there is infrastructure on the continent. And I think that's a delicate balance that I am proposing. It's a mix of economic and political issues. Why do people use Gmail? It's easy, it's free. At the onset. It's not, we know it's not free at the back end. You are the product. Yes, you are the product, but it is free to sign on. It is reliable and available, and no matter what we want to say, we should look at the infrastructure that some of our governments provide to their agencies. And so these are the real issues that we need to address. How do we bring, and I think what we're seeing on the continent, how do the governments create the environment to deploy that infrastructure here? And I think also, how do we work with the global players who have these global platforms that have this high adoption to ensure that they are now not just talking about data sovereignty, but also data localization. And also we look at the size of our markets. Yes, even though we have a larger population, how much information is consumed by the average citizen versus advanced markets where digitization is much more advanced, affordability is much higher, and so the amount of data that they are able to store, the applications on top of the free ones that they're able to pay for are much higher than what we have in our continent. I agree fundamentally that we need to take control of our destiny in terms of the data of our citizens and the applications layer to run the key elements of our society. However, and we're not making good enough progress towards doing that. But however, the way to achieve that is to recognize the win-win and the economic and technological realities. How do we bring more of that value chain? We're not going to bring all of the value chain to Africa overnight. We don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the skills, there's so much that we don't have the market power to support that investment day one. But how do we lay out a roadmap? How do our countries work together? How do we start putting in the enabling environment to ensure those jobs are being created here? The infrastructure is being built here. More of the data that we need is stored here. Development of applications we need to drive our societies, and the intellectual property that goes with that is controlled by our people. And I think that's when we find solutions, because sometimes we're at one end or the other, and right now, until we actually start making meaningful progress, the global players are doing their business. Our people want it. They're not forcing it. They're not forcing you to use the Google search engine or to use Gmail. People are selecting to do that. So we've got to work with those realizations and create real options in terms of how our countries, our region participates in this global evolving ecosystem. But deciding that unless the ecosystem is wholly here, we're not going to participate, just says we're going to be left out. And we will not derive the benefits of productivity, of jobs and things. And so we have to create, we have to be strategic and create that win-win scenario. And really need to focus on the issue of infrastructure on the continent. And I would say even our policymakers are not doing enough to enable that infrastructure to be built on the continent, serving people on the continent, lowering the barriers internally to enable that. And that's when we have better negotiating power to have this conversation.
Yes, and now I want to hear Colin and Ebenezer's reflections on the current discussion. And I can see, Lasina, you have a comment, but yes, let's first get their reactions.
Yeah, it's a really good question. How to start this first step, and in this region, in Middle East region, before there's no Emirates, there's no Ethiopia, there's no Etihad Airlines, but they built these airlines, and they built the airlines and they attract the travelers outside the region, from Asia, from Africa, from Europe. 80%, 85% of the passengers that do transit, and they did this through the corporate way. So building a cloud, we need to know it's not just enforcing by government, but also the private companies needs to be there. And all could be a semi-government background, but it should be a corporate move. So by corporate move, a model, and then we can bring them real affordable, competitive offerings. Because in the end, if the price from Europe, from America, is half of the price, then the users will go there automatically. So this is also a scale economy. We need to have the scale. I fully agree with Nitin. We must have, we cannot just isolate country by country. I was talking to one partner, the potential partner, we are talking about business. They say, I want to launch the cloud service in one of the major countries in Africa. And his model is cloud of cloud. Means he will build a cloud, and in the end, he resell the hyperscalers services. And this limited our capability to real build a cloud. I was talking to another customer, and they say, he decided to build a public cloud. In the end, and his own IT services still running on the traditional infrastructure, not moving to even his own cloud. So these are the real cases in Africa. So we need to really have this awareness. The cloud is more safer. The cloud is more economic. And the cloud should be beyond a country, should be a continent in Africa move. And these are what we need to do.
Thank you. Ebenezer?
I think the tension between localization and sovereignty is one that needs some serious redress if we're going to make a meaningful headway. And that is needed also because you cannot afford to later hyperscale data centers all over the continent. If you go by the numbers that were previously projected, then you are even tempted to say that Africa needs 10 data centers to serve the current capacity, but we have 80. So quickly, it tells you also that there is the issue of demand that we need to work on, such that the users are not only there in numbers, but also they are using adequately. And the use cases are also there, and solutions are there to help them use digital services in all practical ways, whether at the individual, at the enterprise, or even at the informal level. So the need for us to drive digital adoption across the continent, the need for us to drive further penetration of digital services across the continent is very, very important. Maybe rather than 600 million people using internet, we should be looking at 1.3, 1.5 billion by now. The usage per person should be 5-10 times what it is today. So there's some work to be done at that level, whether it's going to be done at the public sector level, private sector level, collaborative partnership approach. I think there is some job to be done critically there. The other one is when you deal with the demand issue, and then you also deal with the tension between localization and sovereignty. We also need to be very clear that the users of data, you have the individual users, and that is where the issue of data protection and privacy comes in. But you also have the public interest when all the data is also put together. Before you even get to the national interest where matters of sovereignty, safety, and security becomes paramount. And in dealing with the tension between localization and sovereignty, we also must ensure that we don't shortchange any side of the aisle. Consumers want the best digital services and solutions to run their lives, for their lifestyle enhancement, for efficiency, for connectivity. And if we hold on too much and say in the interest and in the name of localization, data will not go out, it also affects innovation. That innovation will not deliver the long-term benefits of scope to the same consumers who are also citizens in all these countries. And then once that happens, then the public interest, not only from the point of view of delivery of public goods, but also from the point of view of how data also benefits the public, becomes a big issue. So the tension must be resolved, but we should also not sacrifice any of the levers within the ecosystem.
Thank you. In the few remaining minutes before we open up to Q&A, I want us to switch gears. So I think if we're saying that the big idea is that if we can fully harness the value of data, whichever analogy we're using, whether data is the new oil, the new cocoa, our idea is that if we can fully harness its value, then we can create the millions of jobs, the tens of millions of jobs that need to be created every year. We can, foster a thriving ecosystem. So I'd love to hear, and we can start with Nitin and then Funke on how you see the current data ecosystem, how you see the current data regulation serving the ecosystem of startups and businesses.
So I think, excuse me, going back to the point around, I think that the job to be done today is how do we drive that demand, right? With more demand, the economics of data localization will start to look a lot more attractive, right? So for me, the question is, the 600 million number that we see, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, that number is 300 million, right? So, so there's a significant difference between sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa in terms of internet penetration and therefore demand. So if I just talk about sub-Saharan Africa, internet penetration is, internet users is roughly at 300 million people. About 800 million people have never used the internet. Right? Now that is a really, really profound challenge and a really profound opportunity. So what we need to be working towards is how do we create the structures, how do we create the regulatory frameworks in order to make that happen more swiftly. Now what does that take? Right? At a very high level, without sort of spending an hour talking about that, at a very high level, am I covered by a network? Do I have the ability to buy a device that will help me connect to that network? If I have both those things, can I afford the data? If I have those three things, do I know how to extract value from the internet for me and for my own personal challenges, right? And I think if we start to solve some of those challenges with the right regulatory frameworks, with the right infrastructure investments, access-related initiatives, I think that sort of drives demand, and that sort of then leads to localization naturally and in an economically very sound manner. So that would be that's what I would posit on this.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My view is we need to build more infrastructure and more ecosystems locally. And when we look at how the digital economy is evolving, even for the African startups, I would say perhaps more of them have succeeded just flying under the radar. So government has not been paying a lot of attention. But as these companies become bigger, and we look at where value and wealth is being created, it's not necessarily on the continent. A lot of it is also being created outside. So how do we domesticate that wealth creation, the value creation? And it's truly by building more of the infrastructure, by creating more enabling environments for business, by providing the incentives that make those businesses want to be local businesses, African businesses listed on African stock exchanges, paying corporate taxes in Africa, hiring more people in Africa. So, it's really about creating the infrastructure that enables those startups to thrive and grow their markets and scale up. It's about and having the regional markets, not just the national markets, that now make it easy for some of those companies to scale because they have a larger addressable market. It's about providing the incentives that enable them do that, and recognizing that in our society there and in our governments, there's a lot of focus on what I would call input taxes as opposed to output taxes. So we're taxing what enables people to do business as opposed to taxing the outcomes and the profits after these businesses have scaled. And I think we need to change the orientation if we're going to capture the benefits of this young generation. But I truly believe infrastructure, ecosystems, and incentives will make a big difference in not only growing our startup ecosystem faster and creating jobs, but ensuring also that a significant portion of the wealth created remains on the continent to continue to drive economic growth.
Thank you. And I know there's still a lot that the speakers would love to say, but I'll open up for Q&A because I think some of those questions will be addressed. We'll take 3 questions at a time. I saw a hand there, I saw a hand there. Oh, sorry, and there's another side. And there. So 3 questions at a time. Say who you are and the question and who it's for. So I said 1, 2, okay, we'll take 4. 3, 4. No, you're also one of the 4. And we'll hopefully get an opportunity for, you'll be in the next batch, you'll be the first I've seen.
Okay, hi everyone. Aubrey Ruby, longtime advisor to investors, mainly US investing in African markets, but also an investor in African startups. So my question is particularly for Ebenezer, but anyone else on the panel, which is Africans pay the most for data as a percentage of income in the world. That's mostly because they do prepaid. They don't do prepaid, they essentially pay as you go. So my question is, how do we reduce the cost of data? What are the true levers? And do we have an option like India had with Reliance Jio and the dramatic reduction in data that resulted in a creative industries boom? And Nigeria is on the edge of a creative industries boom, but the cost of data would, I think, pour fuel on the fire. So love to hear the thoughts on practical things that can be done.
We'll take all of them and then we'll respond.
Thank you. Ayu Adigbo is my name. I work for Aravo from Nigeria. The question I would like to ask is, we talk about the deficit in infrastructure, the structure, but there seems to be detached between the regulatory authorities and the private sector. So much effort is put in place, and the question is, how do we influence the public sector or the regulatory authority to actually support the discussion going on in the room? It's a big question we need to address. The second question is the question of talent in Africa. Day by day, we're seeing exit of talent from Africa. Looking at this from supply chain, from value chain perspective, how do you begin to actually make use of the data at the end of the day in terms of the data science, the AI, several other professionals you actually need, because we're talking of data available in different formats, in raw format, data that are not processed. So we also need human capacity to be able to transform the data at the end of the day. So that conversation is missing in the room. The last one is trying to look at it, start with end from mind. In the face of African Free Trade Agreement, we're talking of data sovereignty across different silos in Africa. How do we begin to integrate data that cut across different countries in Africa and begin to leverage on this? Do we say that data in Nigeria sits in Nigeria, data in Ghana sits in Ghana, data in Kenya sits in Kenya, regardless if there are capacity within those local entities to actually articulate and mine those data? So we need to answer those questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Those were me. There was a question here and a question there. We might not answer all three in the interest of answering other people's questions.
My name is Sidi Heba. I am from the National Bank of Mauritania. And I would like, first of all, to point out that there is a huge difference between precariousness and poverty. In our slums, we have a very high level of productivity because you have a welder here, you have someone selling any digital items here, and you have a carpenter here. We have a high level of productivity, and we have a very young population. I have seen in Mauritania donkey-driven cars used by teenagers who are very technologically savvy, and they use WhatsApp to optimize their commerce, their trade. So big data is very important, connectivity, AIE. These we have lost, or we basically, comment dirais-je, in the industrialization process was lost in Africa, but we can catch up with the digital age. We have a very dynamic population, very young, but my question to you, how can we streamline these processes, taking into consideration digital sovereignty, digital agency, data protection? A country like ours use iCloud technology in Europe. Why can't we do the same with Nigeria or Cameroon or Senegal next door?
Okay, thank you. And finally, there at the back.
Hello, my name is Idrissa Ketouni. I'm from Morocco. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for your shared insights. It's very interesting. But I'm so very happy to see that data governance, data sovereignty is an issue for my brothers from Mauritania, for my friends from Nigeria. And I'm representing today a cybersec company. And I'd like also to have your insights on how can we tackle digital sovereignty as per se, but also viewed from the angle of focusing on cybercrime, how can we fight cybercrime? And also for our African countries, how can we tackle digital identity? Because we are approached by several national data protection agencies that want to have expertise on how to settle an ID, a digital ID for their country. So I'd like to know how would you see that leapfrog we have to do in Africa regarding digital sovereignty, but not as itself, but put it into a context, an ecosystem of cybercrime and digital identity. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll try to get through as many as possible, but with brief responses. So we'll start with Ebenezer on the high cost of data question, followed by the deficit in infrastructure. Lassina, you can talk about it from the public perspective, and then Funke and digital ID. So you'll combine those, and Funke from the private sector perspective. We have one on ACFTA and siloing. Maybe let's see, we'll get back to that. Who would want to cover the cybercrime and digital sovereignty one? You take it? Okay. Let's start with those for now, and the digital identity.
Okay. No, thanks for the question on how to get data pricing down, the whole issue of affordability, and the need for us to recognize that the price of data per GB has reduced between 40 to 60% in the past 3 years. The data is one of such commodity that even as global inflation goes up, the price continues to come down. But it's still very high, and we recognize the need to further work on it. And I would take two critical areas that requires further work. First is the issue of penetration that we talked about. How do we get more smartphone users so that the marginal cost per user can come down? So that means we need to work collaboratively between private sector, with other partners within the ecosystem, and even government for waivers on taxes on smartphones, etc., and do some reverse engineering even to get the cost of smartphone down so that we can see the numbers moving from the current about 340 million users within sub-Saharan Africa to 570 to 600 million in the next 2 to 3 years. Because the more users you have, the lower will be the cost. Then the other one is how do we also internally reduce the cost of manufacturing, the cost of production of every GB of data. About 2 years ago, the cost of producing GB of data in this continent was about $2, compared to less than 30 cents in other markets. And that means that, again, we need to work with governments to make sure the spectrum prices are lower, because spectrum price per population is much higher in our continent than elsewhere. We also need to work with government to ensure some of the infrastructure that other markets may take for granted, fiber connectivity, shared services, etc., are also lowered and available and efficient. And then the last one is the issue of power. Power is such a major cost of production. In our continent, you need to back up in 3 areas. So first is the grid, second will be the generator, and third will be batteries. Okay, so the cost of power is more than 300% on unit basis compared to what you find in other markets. So how do we also work to ensure not only reliable power supply, but also even into the future, we kick in the renewables, because the more consumption happens, the more demand happens, the higher the level of adoption, the more we need to also solve the issue of renewables. So we don't get to a situation where now you have a lot more users, demand has gone up, and then you also have the challenge of power renewables on your hands. So those will be some of the things we need to do, working together in a very collaborative fashion to bring the price of data down.
Thank you very much. On the infrastructure, I think the picture is not really that bad as we actually think. Today, the connected people in Africa represent about 38.9%. As you know, the overall planet, we only have 54% on average connected. 2.9 billion people are still not connected. In Africa, that 54% represent 38.9. However, we do have something called users gap. I think the VP knows about it. Users gap means we have internet infrastructure, but people are not using it for four reasons mainly: affordability, devices you talked about, context, and also cybersecurity. I think if we work together, even we can actually close that gap before 2025, which basically put Africa to a 70%. I know we're running out of time. I'm just gonna, this is another debate. We can stay here the whole day for that. So the picture is not really that bad. So coming back to digital ID, which is very important. Fundamentally, we will never leapfrog. If you want to leapfrog, you don't copy. You do things in an African context. You copy, you modify, and you paste. You don't copy and paste to leapfrog. For us to leapfrog, we are living in a very unique moment, in a very unique situations. Without the digital identification, we will not make it to the leapfrogging stage. What does mean digital ID? It is not a voting card, it is not a biometric ID, it is a unique identification of our population. That's why when you fail, a government fails to identify uniquely its population, they basically use what? They use the GAFAM ID, KYCs. Well, not GAFAM, Google and others. If I have to be more precise. Okay, I think we're running out of time.
I think I just made it worse.
No, they use, because everyone, the government will never be able to stop the private sector. Private sector will always come up with a KYC. Telco came out with a KYC. If Africa is generating today $495 billion transaction value in mobile money, why are we not leveraging the mobile numbers as the mobile IDs? We've seen it happening elsewhere. And that is our debate at Smart Africa. That's what we are planning to do. To leverage Africa is a mobile-only continent. So why not leveraging that? You can see a 30 million population with a 10 million biometric ID with a 28 million phone number. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I would say, all these things really tie back to infrastructure. We don't have the infrastructure for the identity. The private sector has more of it than the public sector, but most public sectors are trying to recreate in an environment where resources are scarce. We're not sharing the infrastructure that exists. And even in advanced markets, there are regulations in place to ensure that infrastructure sharing takes place. I said when you look at economies in Africa and the GDP per capita, less than $10,000, how are you comparing yourselves to Singapore in terms of 70,000? And you have to come up with the strategies. And we don't have the policy frameworks that are driving towards results in terms of shared infrastructure, in terms of public sector leveraging what the private sector has invested in for the economic development of our societies and citizens, the cost of power, the cost of security, devices, the focus on input taxation, so taxes and barriers and fees for granting new licenses, as opposed to looking at the outcome in terms of how does it lower cost to the citizens and how does it drive increases in productivity and demand elasticity to bring down costs. And I think really until we start looking at this win-win scenarios, Ayo asked a question about how does private sector influence public sector to do these things. I think that's why we're having these conversations, and we need to continue having these conversations so that our public officials can recognize the dynamics and the economic models of this new digital world and put those in place so that we can get the results we need in Africa.
Lovely. Thank you. I'm so sorry because I think we might be out of time. We're out of time. Oh, I really apologize for that. I know there was more questions. Looks like there's a quick comment. We can have a quick comment from here, quick comment from here, and maybe, hopefully, for the people with questions remaining, you might be able to find the speakers after the session. Yeah.
So I really see, the question, the answer to the question, how to build a single market of data and building a federated cloud infrastructure across continent. I think this is, the answer. So build a federated data infrastructure, and this, will be, built, from Egypt, from Nigeria, from Ghana, from Morocco, from South Africa, from other countries. But all this, in the end, through regulation, a framework, federated. And that will be named as Africa Cloud. And that will be the answer.
Just a very quick comment. I think there is a massive opportunity for us to think about this in a pan-African way. And this was my earlier point about data localization versus data sovereignty. I think it's important to protect data sovereignty without, and then discussing at what level do we need data localization. Now, if we thought about this in a pan-African manner, we could be talking about localization of data in Africa rather than in each individual country, in 54 different countries. Right? And that sort of changes the conversation quite substantially. So this goes back to a conversation you and I were having just before we started, which is huge opportunity to use the EFFECTA framework to drive more harmonization across more regulations, across more industries. And I think that would be a significant game changer to think about this in a pan-African fashion.
Wonderful. Thank you. So let's give a round of applause to the panelists and also to the experts.